Okay. Thanks again for joining us. It's me again, introducing the next seminar, which is going to be Judging Considerations. In my new job, I failed to do something on the last seminar, so I'm going to do that now, which is announce the sponsors for that seminar. So our last seminar, Basic Craftsmanship, the sponsors for that were the book Collecting Muscle Car Model Kits by Tim Boyd and a book by Mark Gustavson, A Car for All Season, Starbird's Predicta. So once again, those are the sponsors for the last one. So a slight change in the lineup for the judging considerations today. We have Mark Gustavson, Bob Wick. I got it here just for a second. And Greg Nichols. So we'll have those judging considerations by those three. And let me get back to. So the sponsor for this one is Superior Paint Supply Incorporated. So without further ado, judging considerations.
I need the.
You need a mic?
You need that one. Thank you all for being here tonight. Bob Wick and I judged every GSL. Bob Wick has joined me as a judge since 1988 or 89. Since that time, Bob and I decided that we needed a third judge, and so alternatively, we have hired on experts to serve with us. And we're very happy this year to welcome back Greg Nichols, who served with us for 2 years, 4 or 5 years ago, since replaced. Excuse me?
He was actually once 10 years ago, but that's all right.
And we were very pleased to work with him. So, what we'd like to do today is to briefly talk over the issues that we face as judges, to give you our insights, to give you our perspectives on how it works, and then in the final 15 or so, 20 minutes, to open it to questions for you. We would like to hold the questions until that time so we can get to the material. And that time is a free-for-all. Ask what you like, and whether in detail or in scope. One of our concerns about GSL, one of my organizing themes about GSL was to have a series of standards and perspectives that were independent of the nature of the model itself. We had heard stories about other contests, national contests, the old NPC series, where certain styles of models were de facto favored, where judging occurred in restrooms, and all of that kind of thing. And those things were inimical to my vision of what GSL ought to be about, and that is a fair set of standards applied uniformly and dispassionately, so that the persons who entrusted their work to us for evaluation could be assured that they were being treated with fairness and consideration. So with that in mind, we'd like just to sort of have a round robin discussion here of what our perspectives are. I'm going to turn to Bob now to talk about the basic structure of judging, and then Greg and I will talk about some of the details of it. Bob?
Well, welcome to all of you. We have refined this. You will find in your handbook an overview how judging is done. That's what this presentation is based on. The other thing is that we are available during the event if you have questions. That's not lobbying the judges. That is simply if you have questions, either the proctor's can answer them in terms of where the model should be placed in the various classes, or if ultimately at the very end you have questions about how your model fared during the judging, we're welcome. Your questions are welcome. We're happy to answer that. There have been a number of people who have gone through that process over the years, come back 2 years later and done much better. So it is time well spent on both our parts. Basically, the idea is to go through and evaluate on a continuing basis of elimination the models that are in competition. We do evaluate every model that is on the table. We don't do prejudging. We don't walk through and look at models and go, well, that's not a contender. What we will do, and some of you may have already been contacted, you may be later on in this during the event, is make sure that the models are appropriately classified. So if there's a question about whether a model really fits into the class that it's entered in, we will do our best to get hold of you, go through that, find out why you placed it where it did, offer you an alternative if that's a better suited class. Generally speaking, though, it is up to the builder to decide where they want it to go within the class rules. And if there's a question of which of two classes, or maybe even three, that it fits into, ultimately that becomes your choice as long as it meets all of the requirements. So when we get into doing the judging, the room is closed. It's not open to the public, obviously. And our discussions tend to be thorough and frank as we go through the process. We will do it class by class, go through, look at every model, do an initial elimination. First things that we look for are things like basic craftsmanship. Are the injection pin marks sanded off? Is it properly painted, prepped? Are there glue marks there? Do all four tires sit on the ground? Does it look right? Because remember, what we are looking for are miniatures of one-to-one vehicles. That's the whole point, is to make it look real. So those are the kinds of things that we start with. We go through that process. We will move the first round that are eliminated class by class, and we do it as a complete class. We don't go through, eliminate the bottom end of every class and then come back and start it the first class again. We do it class by class, and so the discussions continue within that class as we're doing the judging. As we go through it, we will obviously develop our own, logical choices for first, second, third, or actually best in class, second, third, and fourth place. Quite often they are basically the same because we've judged together for a long enough time. We have a pretty good idea of what we're looking for and how to look for it. There are inevitably discussions within each class about why something should place higher than another entry. And that is part of what we do, again, with every class. And they are very serious discussions. If we are having a debate about which should be best in class, which should be second, we are required and expected to state our position to the other two judges and defend that, convince them if we can. If not, it's up to them to convince us. But it is a unanimous decision when all four of those awards are awarded for a class. Obviously, some classes are much more difficult, time-consuming, and harder to judge than others, but everything goes through that process. So once we've looked at that, the basic build on the kit, then we get into things like the detailing. Is it done in a way that reflects accurately what a real car would look like? Is the detailing appropriate to what is there? Does it fit within the rules, if the rules apply to any of that? And we will literally continue to work our way through all of those considerations as we go along. We look for scale accuracy as well as detailing. Are the panel thicknesses reasonably correct? Are the spark plug wires as big as the radiator hoses? And if so, that's not a good sign. If the car literally could not be driven, if, for example, if we're looking at it, the steering wheel is jammed right up against the front seat, that's not a drivable car in one-to-one, so that's not what we're looking for here. So we go through those kinds of things. We look at the working features as well. Do they work properly? Do they work accurately? If you're doing a throttle linkage, does it function the way throttle linkage would on a one-to-one car? That's the approach that we take, and those are the details that we're looking at. Fit and finish, again, not only no glue marks, but is the paint or the finish appropriate to the size of the vehicle? If it's a metallic paint, does it look like it would be a metal flake in one-to-one? And if so, it's probably not a very accurate finish. Now, one of the things we've evolved over the years is it used to be best paint. And what we realized is it's not just best paint, it's best finish. And that applies in things to like dioramas. It applies to vehicles that are not particularly high-end builds in real life. But if it accurately reflects what that vehicle would be, that is the finish that we're looking for. So if it is a rusted out Hulk, is the rust accurate? Does it look like convincing rust, or does it look like somebody just took a brush and, you know, ran some orange paint down the sides? So it is finish, it is not just paint. If it's got wood, or it's got brass, or it's got other kinds of materials that are used on it, are they appropriately rendered and did they look realistic? So that really is not only paint, but paint and finish.
Let me just interject one thing here. It's entirely possible that a diorama could be best finished.
Right.
It's entirely, we're looking for that example should it occur. That it's not just the shiny paint. If there, we also look for textures within the engine compartment. Typically in American cars in the 60s, those will be a kind of matte or semi-gloss black. If that's true, they were not stipple finishes. They were a very smooth finish. And when you scale up from 25th to 1:1, what will those shapes be like in the real world? And Bob touched on this earlier with respect to how big the metallic particles are. Now, Dave Morton did something very smart here 2 years ago when he did whatever that sports car was. I don't remember the subject of it. But the green.
Mike, a little closer, please. Thank you.
Dave Morton did something really smart with his entry in one of the classes last time. He mixed his own paint and used, as he told me, these new German metallic powders, which are very, very small in micron. I think they're probably 30 or 40 microns. And if blown up, it would accurately reflect what a metallic finish would be in 1:1. Most finishes you get out of cans or out of, if you have your paint shop mix up, your paint supplier mix up a color that represents, a Ford Aqua or whatever, and it's a metallic. If you take the metallic particles and blow them up 25 times, they're going to be 32nd of an inch in diameter, and that's, as Bob Touch said, that's metal flake, that's not metallic. So it's as the standards evolve here, you've got to think about about the finishes in scale. You see, and you've got to anticipate what it would be like if viewed in 1:1.
Actually, in line with that, at the previous seminar, anybody who was there, they were talking about clear coating, and they were talking about putting decals on before the car is clear coated. And I was thinking at the time, if you're doing a replica of a factory stock vehicle, let's take the 69 Camaro that was the example on the screen. At the factory, those were vinyl applications that were put on the finished coat, and they were not clear coated. So if you were doing a replica of a model and you wanted to really be accurate, you would do those after you had finished the model, and it probably would have been clear coated in those days anyway. But there's a difference in the way the application looks if a decal is sitting on top of rather than buried under clear coat. You may even need to put two decals, one on top of the other, partly for opacity, but partly to generate a height of the lip of that decal. Those are the kinds of things that we end up looking for when it gets down to it at the very end, and that's part of paint and finish. So there are those kinds of things that we look at, and again, we can talk about that, and these guys will talk about it a little bit later, and you can ask questions toward the end. The other thing that we really look for and really appreciate, well, two things. One is adhere to the rules. If it requires, an instruction sheet, bring the instruction sheet and put it on the table so we don't have to hunt you down and say, do you have an instruction sheet for this? If not, it moves to another class. You're going to be very unhappy about that. So read the rules and follow them. The other thing is the documentation. We have not built every model kit that's ever been issued. We probably even haven't looked at all of them. So we don't know the subtleties. We don't know what needs to be corrected. We don't know what the problems are with a lot of this stuff. and we don't necessarily know what you've done. The documentation is what gives us that material that allows us to have our discussions and say, look, this was faithfully done. There's a presentation of it here. So even the stuff that we're not sure about, if it's documented, we can't argue with that. And that also, even if it's not required for the class, like a replica, all of that stuff is very helpful during the final judging, because if we have a question on two models and we're not sure which one is more accurate, and or what was done, or how well it was done, or how it was done, if one of those has documentation explaining it and the other doesn't, and they're equally well built, then the nod is going to go toward the documentation, because you've proven what you've done in building a replica or a miniature of a one-to-one vehicle. So those are basically the things that we cover to some extent or another. Those are the things that are helpful to us in terms of doing the judging. So think about it from not only the input standpoint, but step back from it as you're building it and after it's finished, and say, what would I like the judges to know about this? If I was a judge, what do I need to know that I did in order to make them aware of that, so that the car is evaluated, the model or diorama is evaluated in a realistic and an appropriate way. So those, again, are the things we generally touch on. That's how we frame our deliberations. They do go till 3 or 4 in the morning. That's not unusual. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mark and Greg, and they can continue from here.
I think it would be important for Greg to talk about some of the technical details. As one of the expert machinists in our hobby, he has a special perspective, I think, on what scale details need to be like with parts that can be turned or milled. So Greg, who's the builder of Backdraft on the Best of Show a few years ago, why don't you talk to us about how you evaluate realistic shapes and applications on a mechanical basis?
That's one advantage of using metal. You can get a scale thickness. With plastic, it's very difficult sometimes. You can sand it down, but then it becomes very brittle. See, I wasn't prepared for any of that stuff. I found out 2 days ago I was going to fill in for Randy. I would tell you, 12 years of building that model, it had to be perfect. So I was almost building out of fear sometimes, it felt like. Because I know what the judging here is like. I know it's very fair, but I know it's very intense. And if you make a mistake and you think, oh, they won't see that, wrong. So the whole building process was, is this mistake going to make me lose? Or is if I correct it and do it again, I'm still in the game? And if you're going to build a model for competition, especially here, you have to have that attitude. It's kind of a different way of looking at it, because model building is always just relaxed and sit back. But if you really want to compete, 2 things you have to do. First, you should take some time and just grab some kits and sit down and build on box stock. Don't add any photo etch, don't add any aftermarket. Just work on the basic skills of putting the model together. You have to have that foundation first. And then when you add all the detailed parts onto that, either that you've bought or you've made yourself, now you really got something. But if you have a model that's just so-so built and then you put all this stuff on it, well, then you have a model that's just so-so built. So really work on the basics of assembling a kit and really get that down, and then add the other stuff onto it. And then it won't matter who's judging. You're going to do fantastic. And the one thing I told them earlier today, one thing you have no control over is what the model's going to be that someone's going to sit right next to you. And I know the time and energy that goes into the models that are sitting in that room. And that will be greatly respected as the judging process goes through. It always is. But the results may not always be what you expect them to be. There's a difference between looking at a model and judging a model. Mark, it's your turn.
One of the things we've noticed over the years is that, particularly in the early years of GSL, not recently, is that people would either murmur among themselves or say to us openly, why didn't this model win and the other prevail upon us, upon it? Our response has been, because we have access to these models and none of you have. We pick them up, we turn them over, we look at them with an exquisite eye for detail. And you would be surprised, well maybe not surprised, at the candidness of these discussions. That's the reason the contest hall is closed, to insulate us and to insulate everyone else from the political realities of speaking bluntly about models. Never disrespectfully, never derisively about the builders, but very candidly. This is really well done, we would say, of one particular feature of one model compared to another in the same class or that was maybe placed adjacently to it. But that's the process. That is part of our commitment to evaluating these things fairly with respect to a consistent standard applied consistently throughout that entire class. Bob's right, we don't jump between classes when we evaluate. We clear each class and then move on to the next one. And there have been times, some classes are easier to judge than others. You can see that perhaps. Some classes are extremely difficult. We judged, I think, street writer class a few years ago, and it took us probably the better part of almost 2 hours to get through 30 models, or 33 models. They were just so terrifically well done. And finally, we're down to the point of doing the kind of analysis that Greg's talking about, and that's looking at minute detail. I mean, literally looking to see if the pulleys on the engine are of an appropriate diameter, whether the fan belts are just kit pieces you painted black, whether the wheels sit squarely and whether the caster and camber is off. Things like that. That sounds trivial, but when you get down to it, you have to draw some distinction between models so that you can choose one legitimately and honestly against another, and be willing to defend those decisions, which we are. We have often, we have offered consistently, or if you want to have a discussion about them afterwards, come up and do so. I remember Larry Booth in the early years of GSL came up, and I think it was GSL 3, maybe 4, and he entered a 59 Cadillac, and it was very photogenic, but not particularly well done, as he would admit. He was upset, and he came to talk to me about it afterwards, and I sat down with him for probably a half an hour, maybe a little longer, and critiqued it. And he sat with a notepad and took notes, and as the conversation went on, he calmed down. I saw a rising commitment on his part, a passion about doing the job right, which was always his motivation. And twice, I think at GSL 14, he came back and won Best of Show with that exquisite 57 Thunderbird painted gray, with the engine turned dash and everything else. It's one of the best things I've ever seen. And this came from the guy that built that 59 Cadillac. You would not have believed it, except his commitment, his honesty, his willingness to subject himself to the process led him to Best of Show. And I have just the highest, I'm using him as an example of the highest regard for the kind of competitors that this show generates. So if you have questions, for instance, for heaven's sakes, come up and ask them. But just be aware that we have access to models that you don't, because we get to turn them over and you don't, you better not. Okay, Bob?
I'm actually going to depart a little bit from the judging criteria because I think this is very, very important. And it's something we see as a problem for, not a lot necessarily, but for builders. But you find it happens less and less the better the quality of the build is and the better the builder is at what they're doing. One of the things that helps a lot if you're building something is know what you're going to build. If it's for a particular class, make sure it fits within that class, and then once you've gotten that decided, how are you going to go about doing that? What's going to make it look realistic? What can you skate on? If you've got, say, a drivetrain and the parts don't all really fit together if they're adjusted for scale, where can you cheat that? Can you take out a little bit of the transmission above the cross member? where nobody will ever see it? Or do you just make the drive shaft too short? So it's the way that you approach what you're doing and then refining the way that you're going to go about doing that. Another thing, Mark and I had put together a book on, or a presentation on how to build better models. This goes back several years. But one of the things was to write a backstory. How did this vehicle get to be what's on the table? Because again, that's going to clarify your goals. It's going to give you what you need to do. One of the problems we see is that there are mixed messages. And I know this is sounding really, really esoteric, but that's what we get into during this judging. How come this isn't so convincing? That one's better at it. Well, that one has a story. It tells us what the builder was trying to do and how they went about doing it. So if you're going to build competitively, if you're going to build for fun, if you're going to build to enjoy it, enjoy the people, that's fine, but that's what you're building to do. Recognize that. If you are building competitively, and you want to be part of that group that's the final cut in that class, understand what you're trying to do and then go about deciding how to do it and be brutal in your evaluation when you're going through it. As Greg said, is that mistake going to cost me? And look at it as a judgment as much as you can. Remove yourself from it. One of the suggestions at the seminar that was done just before this was to take photographs of the model during process, look at them, and you're going to find mistakes that you don't see when you're looking at something. And I think, personally, I think part of that is because I find it when I do writing and I go through and I edit my own work. I miss stuff because I know what I meant to say, and I don't always say it, and I don't always read what is there. So you have to look at the model the same way. You have to back off from it. You can't make the assumption that, yeah, I did a good job on that because that's what I wanted to do. Maybe you didn't do as good a job as you thought you did, and that's going to cost you in the end. Again, it's a matter of how much time you're going to put in, how much effort, how much money, how important it is and all of that. But we do consistently find during judging, the models that are entered that have a story, a history, a reason that I built this, and documentation of how I went about building it, are the models that do better because it gives us more to work for and it gives you more to work with while you're building that model. And I think that's very, very important to recognize when you get to competition level building.
I think one of the factors you want to think about is to be brutally intellectually honest about your own work. Critique the daylights out of it. What may satisfy you on the third month of the build may not satisfy you the fifth month in. If that's the case, go back and redo it. I've heard Steve Perry talk about that, his own commitment to that kind of level of excellence. He went back and redid things. I redo things all the time. Because as things go on, they don't satisfy me any longer. But what they did initially, they don't now. And you have to be willing to be hypercritical of your own work. That is to take as much as you can an independent position with respect to your most favorite effort. I think that's what distinguishes great modelers, and that's what leads to people who prevail at this contest. I've talked to Greg several times. He's done some parts recently for the Links project, and he and I've gone through that. We've debated over the phone. Is this the right shape? What are we going to do about the placement of the wheels with respect to the wheel wells and all these kinds of considerations? And those discussions led by him, I was just there to listen, were enormously important to me in helping me to think through the implications of the parts he was making for that project. And that's a tribute to Greg, because you brought a discipline to me that I didn't have, frankly. So stand back, be critical of your own work.
Actually, I'd like to make one more point in line with that. And that is, as we do anything, in this case, let's take the building the models, you get better at it as you build the model. So what was good to begin with, you get further down the road and you go, God, that looks like crap. And it's because you learned how to do that better while you were building that model. And that's the honesty that Mark's talking about. You really have to look at it and go, I can do better than that. Then you have to decide whether or not that's gonna cost you in the judging and whether you wanna go put that effort in. But that's what Greg was talking about as well. You go back and you evaluate it, and if in fact you suddenly go, or you come to think, I don't think that's really what I wanna do, then you gotta look at that. So, okay, so anyway, that was the point that I wanted to make. You get better, we get better as we do something. So in that process of a 3-year build, or a 2-year build, or a 1-year build of something, you're gonna be a year better at it than you were when you started. Keep that in mind. Recognize that you're growing as a builder, and your standards are gonna change. So.
3 years, you're barely getting started.
How many years do you have back drive?
12.
Okay.
Do you want to ask some questions?
Yeah, we're in this 30 minutes. I think that's the essence. I think that's the essence of our presentation. We'd like to open up the questions. I'm sure there are some, and we welcome them all. And be as candid as you'd like. We certainly have been with you. So please ask your questions. Dave, how do we get the sound from the guys in the
We're
audience?
going to repeat what the question is.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay,
I can
I was just wondering, on a car that's got the wheels taken off to display the, brake system or something like that, do you put the wheels back on?
Do
Just to
we,
make sure
while we're
all the
judging?
wheels touch?
The question is, if the model's displayed with the wheels off to show brake detailing, do we slip the wheel back into place during judging? I don't think we do, because we're worried if the model is machined out of brass, in which case it would be somewhat impervious to damage, we would probably break something, and we don't want to break things. We have broken parts in the past. You've got hands like these when you break parts, but we try not to. There's a real concerted effort not to break your model, so we would probably not do that. Now, on the other hand, if there's a door that opens, or a trunk or something, we'll operate that. If it seems to be fixed in place, glued open or something, we clearly won't break the hinges. But there have been some excellent models here with opening panels, doors, trunk, hatch, whatever, and we will very gently see if it gives. And if it closes down square, if it doesn't have to latch necessarily, but if it does it do so realistically? Is the distance around the perimeter of that panel consistent? So, does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. I'm also thinking some shows I've seen, NASCAR stock car, for instance, the guy's got the engine pulled out, the transmission pulled out, it's all super detailed, but it's entered as a NASCAR stock car. How do you judge that as a car?
Well, my response to that goes back to documentation. If you can present photographs with the wheels and tires on the car sitting on the tabletop and it looks right, that's good enough for me. And if it doesn't look right, that's good enough for me too. But if you want to say, look, this thing goes together, I know you're not going to build it there on the table and see if it fits, then give us the documentation to show us that it does.
Yeah, to your point, a stock car is probably a part more of its life than it's together, to be honest.
I might also say, okay, just even in connection with that, if you're going to open a panel, don't just pull a wire and glue the underside of your trunk. There are a company called Special Shape, I think they morphed into another name, has a U-shaped channel in brass. Anneal it so it gets softer, and bend that channel. Go look at what a real hinge looks like in the trunk of, say, a 65 Mustang, and you'll notice it's not a wire, it's a channel. And the sides come down, and it'll loop correctly. Do that right. If you're going to take the risk to do the opening panel, do it correctly, because we'll look. And the people that hinge doors and trunks and so forth with wires, I mean, it took effort to do that, to be sure. But if they were up against a model that had a special shape hinge made out of that, it's going to prevail. It clearly will, as it should. Steve?
Yeah, I have two questions about judging detail. The first one is, if you've got two subjects, let's use the straight line drag competition category. You've got an early 60s dragster, it's very simple, right? And then you've got a modern pro mod. right? Nothing but plumbing, and somewhere in there is a blower and an engine. So how do you judge those two subjects? And I've heard judges make the comment, well, this one prevailed because everything's there. But there wasn't much that needed to be there, versus one that's very complicated and most of it's there. How do you judge when the subject matter drives very different content?
Let me repeat what Steve's smart question, and that is, does the complexity of the subject affect the judging outcome? And I guess the answer is yes. It is better to have a complete model with all the elements there than to have a more complicated model with only some of the things there. That's my perspective. If you're gonna do it completely.
Really? So the simpler subject that's more complete would prevail?
Sure would, because the other is an incomplete model.
But that's a documentation issue too, isn't it?
Right.
Well, sure it is. And that's where you need to do a build book. You'll notice there are a bunch of them back on the table. These are thoughtful builders who want to convince, Bob said earlier, want to persuade us. And they'll show it, and they'll typically include photographs and details of the real object or the real bits or pieces of the engine management system, whatever. And they'll show it up front and invite our comparison. Do you see? But if there were an early style digger dragster, the kind of thing I like, Steve,
Yeah.
and that were done exquisitely and completely, and done to the same level of craftsmanship as a later model, which was more complex and perhaps more difficult to build, but which was incomplete, all of the things being equal, in my view, the simpler model, which was complete, would win. All other things being consistent, and they're not often consistent.
Second part of my question is,
So, if Bob wants to say something.
Now, if we had two models that were equally rendered, one simpler, one more complex, then the degree of risk taken to build that more complex model would weigh in its favor, from my standpoint, and that's what I would argue in judging. If there's a bunch of stuff in there, and you go, well, this doesn't look realistic, it's not documented, they may run all those lines just like that, but I don't know, and there's nothing that proves that it does. But man, that rail job has everything to scale, it's clean, it is as it should be, it's convincing. The panels on the body are made out of brass or whatever, and it's a better rendered model. Then the complexity of the second one doesn't override that. It didn't accomplish the basic goals of building a convincing vehicle. And I don't want to go splitting hairs and go off on a tangent, but if somebody's run all of the spark plug wires just sequentially around the spark from the distributor to the plugs, and that's not the way it's wired on the real car, and the one next to it is wired properly, especially if it's documented, then that gets the nod. So that's what we're looking at.
If you get to that detail.
Well, there is that.
Yeah, which car is more realistic? And also the details. Are they aftermarket? Were they made by the builder? You know, that will carry a lot of weight as well. Did you create all the details, or did you purchase all the details and then just add them to your model?
The other factor that Bob touched on, and that is the interface between effort and achievement. Risk-taking does not always work. So the model that has enormous risk and pulled off exquisitely, again, I'm going to use by one example, Greg's backdrop from a few years ago, there wasn't a single detail left off that. The more you look, the deeper you look, the more there was. But there are other people who will take, take risks and not pull it off. Compared to someone who took fewer risks, perhaps the subject matter is more simple, and pulled it off exquisitely. So there's this kind of interface that goes on in our discussions where we try to balance one against another. It's not a mechanistic system, it's very heuristic where we argue and battle things back and forth with respect to those considerations. Steve, go ahead.
yeah, so the second part of my question, again on detail, this time relative to scale, right? Lots of the classes don't prescribe a scale. So you've got a very small scale, 1/43, and you've got 1/16, even 1/12, right? So obviously there's more opportunity in the larger scales. There's obviously more
And
difficulty.
more obligation, and more obligation.
And more difficulty in the smaller. So how do you compare those? Because you guys just said the process is ultimately process of elimination. You're getting your models, you're filtering them down, you get one versus the other. What if they're different scales?
That enters into it, but, and again, this squishy is not a good word, but these are the things that get hashed out. I would make the statement at the beginning that if I was serious about winning that class, I'd build on a bigger scale. Because the opportunity is there to show how good I am, and then I can do it better than you can. And that's fair, and we can look at something that's 182nd or 87th, and something that's 132nd or 124th. And that 132nd may be a much better model than the 124th. The 187th just doesn't give you as much opportunity to do that, and that's what you gotta remember what you're competing against in that class.
And the balance to that is the larger it gets, the more you have to do.
Right.
If you build an 8-scale model, you take the old Big T, for instance, if you think you're gonna win by just tossing, even if you do a perfect job of filling seams and correcting the parting marks on the chrome and everything else, if you think that's gonna prevail against a model in a smaller scale that has a lot of added detail and working panels and all the rest, again, equally well done, the 8 scale out of the box will not come close to winning. Because it's not add anything. If it's an 8 scale, you have to add everything. You have to have the clips that hold on the distributor cap. Okay? You have to have scale boots. You have to show what the spark plug looks like. You see? Small examples, but it literally has to be done to a much higher standard the larger you get. I would remark you also, Steve, that we have a small scale class. Just for that purpose, to carve out that exception.
No, but there's a lot of classes that don't have a stipulation, and what I'm hearing, and I've always known was true, you build bigger scale, you've got a better chance.
And you have more obligation.
More obligation.
All other things being equal. Right.
If they come out equal. Okay.
How many pages are you willing to read in a build book?
We've not seen the limit yet.
Okay.
Now,
Just curious,
hold on.
you can build.
Pictures are worth 1,000 words now.
Oh, boy.
I counted that.
Okay, and in line with that, bigger doesn't necessarily mean it's better. What you really want to do is explain as simply as possible what it is you're trying to get across. Because we're just like anybody else, you pick something up and it just looks like it'll take forever to read. Now, we may refer to it for specific things, but realistically, the more eloquently and simply you present what your information is, the better it is all the way around.
Don't add Old Testament long epistles. Okay, just don't do that, because we don't have time to read, 10,000 words. It'd be better to have a series of really exquisite photographs with some terrific informative captions, then move us to the next image. Because there just isn't time, we spend enough time.
Just get to the point.
Yeah, I'd rather see bulleted points than I would a paragraph.
Yeah.
Next.
One other thing, that said, I remember who it was a few years ago did. It was after your backdraft book, someone else did a beautiful job of putting together a build book, and it was so helpful. Because every question we had been addressed by sub-caption and title within that build book. This thing should have had a Pulitzer or something. It was terrific. I wish I could remember the guy that did it, but it was wonderful. And really, really helped pull that model over the top, because as Bob's pointed out, we could see with precision what he had done. Next.
Yeah, anybody else? Crickets.
So you have one quick question. What class do you start judging, or is it random?
You mean what's the first class we
Which
judge?
class do you judge
We
first?
don't judge alphabetically. We will start
Just pick one.
someplace for whatever reason we decide.
And not, at the same time, it's not spent at these classes. Obviously, you've got 12 models versus 30. The latter will take more time. I might also say, in terms of evaluating the models, the best of show come only from best of class. The other master roles can be selected from any model. You could have a model that was not particularly well done, but have a breathtaking interior, and it has good standing to be awarded that, or a terrific paint job, and a model that otherwise has scale flaws, that has a chance of course of winning. But the best of show always comes from best of class, no exceptions, for obvious reasons.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, and I will not like to.
Okay, well, just very quickly, in answer to your question as well, kind of expanding on that, just like anything, if you got a big group of stuff to do ahead of you, and then you've got some smaller groups, you tend to do the smaller groups first, Because the last thing you want to do is get into a discussion that takes up half the judging time on one class and not have the time to finish the rest of it and have to rush it. So generally speaking, we will take the less populated classes first and then work our way up through it.
Yeah, I was gonna just ask, what if there's one car in a class? Is it automatically best in class, or do you judge it that this is not very well built?
No, if there's one model or there are 4 models, they all get an award.
Okay.
I screwed up in all candor in the early GSL, I think it was GSL 4. I remember the class, so I remember the people involved, and I'm glad I don't, frankly, where we, in our great judgment, in our contemptible judgment, decided that there was no first place winner, and we didn't give one. We awarded second, third, and fourth, and that was the stupidest damn thing we ever did. And I was the cause of it, because I had a pure heart, I knew what was best, and it was the dumbest thing that could have ever happened. It was unfair, it was, I think, unethical, and we adopted the rule right after that, since before Bob came on board. He admitted I probably would have been so stupid at the time. But if there's one model, everything gets an award. If there's one model there, it's best in class automatically. If there are 4, we award all 4 places. I might also tell you one more ethical consideration we have. If anyone of the judges deems that they know something too much about a model in that class, or consulted in any material fashion with anybody who built the model in the class, that judge is obligated to step away from the judging process. I did that last time. A local fellow did a model and I had a role in it. I consulted with him, and it was clearly unfair for me even to look at the rest of them. I did not offer an opinion. I walked away, and Randy and Bob judged that class. I think that's the case here again this year. I was involved in one of the models on some level, and I'm stepping away from that class because there has to be the sense, not only among us, but among you, that the process is fair. There has to be confidence in the process. And I want you to know that these ethical considerations, frankly, play a big role. I wish they played a larger role in my earlier judging of JSL, but live and learn. But they honestly play a role.
Another question?
Yeah, I'll go again. How do you judge, let's say you got street rods, you got a rat rod in there, rusty finish, you got a nice shiny new finish. How do you compare those two? All other things being equal, right? Forget about craftsmanship.
Okay.
I'm asking you a hard question. How do you compare rusted out finishes versus shiny show car?
Is the rust well done? Is it in scale? Is it
better-
persuasive?
Yeah.
It's harder to do that. Well, then if it's better done, you have your winner. If that's
What
what it
makes
comes
it better?
down to. It's more convincing. It is more realistic.
If
is
it
a
persuades us
scaled
that it's a
right.
scaled down version of the real thing. And sometimes you will find that sometimes people bury their finishes in clear too much. There are urethane clears out there that should be maybe only used on a 1-to-1 car, should never use on all the car. They come across, the mill thickness is probably 70 to 80 mils.
Yeah.
A factory car doesn't have that much. In 1-to-1 scale doesn't have that much, and it sure's not gonna have anything close to that in 1/24 of that. So you have to be careful about how you apply clears, because and we've seen it. Some people put, paint details on and then bury the clear, and you can see how the clear just sort of runs over the top and turns it into an amorphous shape. It's not gonna win.
For best finish, do you include all the finishes, including the engine, chassis?
Everything.
And the other thing in line with that, sometimes you'll find that car with the shiny paint doesn't have bare metal foil where it should. It may not have other details that are pulled in. So it's not just the shininess or the rustiness and that, it is, because as we go through the judging, if we find 2 things that are essentially equal, the paint, then what else is there that's part of that paint or part of that finish that would tip it to that model? That's the process. Now, if clearly there isn't anything as good as the rat rod, as far as paint goes, then that's fine. That's that point within, our, we don't use a point system, I didn't mean to say the word point, but that's clearly the choice. But that's what we have to do. We have to go through and go, man, these 2 are really, really close. Why does one work better than the other? And there are discussions and arguments about that. And again, we have to be persuasive with each other. and fair to
You would
the
be surprised at the arguments that go on. They're always, we've never thrown things at each
Yeah,
other.
I can
but
vouch for that. There are arguments.
There are real arguments. And we limit the number of people in the room for obvious political reasons, and those there, again, on ethical grounds, have to swear to shut up. We don't want because otherwise the candidness of the evaluation can't occur.
Also, I have to say that when I've helped the judges, when they judge the class that I'm in, I leave.
Absolutely. Sure.
Anything else? Yes.
Because you already, mentioned about the, oversized metallic, looking like metal flake, certainly that would apply to a factory stock car. If the same paint was applied to a dragster or a show car, you just assume it is metal flake?
Sure, because, well, specifically, we're building for a car in the late sixties where it was used, promiscuously. We would assume that it is metal flake. But if you're building a factory Aston Martin and you've got metallic powders in it, which Dave Morton thoughtfully avoided, no Aston Martin from the factory comes with metal flake paint.
Right.
They don't come that way.
Actually, in conjunction with that, if you, let's take your drags for example, and it's painted in a metallic green, and the build book or the information on it says this is a factory Dodge green, because it's a Hemi-powered car, and we look at it and go, well, that doesn't look like factory finish size paint. It looks like a metal flake. Then you lost points on that. You are telling us what it is, and that's not what we're seeing. So be real clear about that kind of stuff as well.
And if you're going to do a custom paint job and you have stripes or painted panels or something like that, whereas the separate colors mesh with one another, make sure it's crisp. I mean, I use Steve Perry again, I'm going to embarrass him further, which is one of the great joys of my life. But let me tell you something. He did a van a few years ago, I don't remember the name of it, but it was a Ford van and it had stripes on the side of it. And I know paint, and I looked at that thing, I bored in on the thing, I'm gonna catch Steve here. But those colors match around corners over difficult surfaces. There wasn't a bobble in it. There were no hidden lines where the tape lines were. He mastered that. And that makes you uncomfortable. You can pay me later, Steve. But my point is that he pulled it off. So if you're going to do a complicated paint system, you're going to do a mural or something, do it right. And there are examples of doing it right. And then, boy, there have been some where the tape lines in real life would be a 1/16th of an inch too wide, and it looks terrible.
And with that, I'm going to make one other point. If you go into the contest hall and you see a model that has something executed the way you would like to see it done and you'd like to be able to do, find the builder and ask the question, how did you do that? In most cases, you'll be told. And part of the reason for that is they've already figured that out. They're on to the next thing. It's for you to catch up. But that's one of the things that I really enjoy about this event, and all of us do. The information flow here is amazing. And it's people who are willing to expand their knowledge out into the rest of the hobby. One of the comments I made last night in the meeting that we had was, one of the things I like about something like a class or a group of people like this is, it's very much like what art school was for me when I was going to school. The reasons the classes were great was you had one assignment and 30 people or 20 people to solve the same problem in their own way. So you get 20 people turning in their assignments. 15 of them would be, that's okay, I see that kind of stuff every time. One would be really horrible. And then you get the other 4 and you go, how did you think of that? How did you get that to work? What was the thinking behind that? And I would hope that whoever did that would tell you, and that would be part of your education. And that's what this is for a lot of people. It is college, it's graduate school. So keep that in mind as you're looking at stuff. Get the information, it's here.
You will notice that almost everybody you'll ever run into here will commonly share what information they have. We've had examples in the past. I'm a strong institutional member of these things. When people came up Marlo's come up and asked a builder that pulled something off really well, whether he would share, and the guy said no. Well, a couple of the trustees went over and, read him the riot act, he said, you will not withhold information. This is a case of us sharing and sharing alike for the betterment of the building, for the advancing achievements of scale model construction. And the cases I'm talking about are few, possibly few in number, because the people here are good spirits and goodwill, and they share, and it's like the tide coming in, all the boats rise. And I think that's one of the really exciting things about the show.
You know, I was watching a video, years and years and years ago, and this guy was actually a model railroader. And he was being interviewed, and he said, if you develop a new technique in your hobby, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to everybody else who enjoys that same hobby. So don't ever be afraid to ask, and make sure you share what you know.
I think our time's up.